Hello and welcome to the video where we're going to be looking at sculpting up this kind of Elder God type Lovecraftian horror. Now this is a monster clay sculpture that I've been putting together over the last few weeks, and it's got a little bit of an interesting origin. The original idea from it came from Facebook. I was just scrolling through and a BBC News story came up with this image. Now that immediately to me looked like some sort of Lovecraftian horror. And I thought to myself, why on earth are the BBC showing pictures of Lovecraftian horrors? So I looked a bit further into the story, and it actually turns out, see if you can guess what it is. Yeah, that's right, it's a turkey. Now, I hadn't realised they looked this alien, and I think it's because they've got this sort of bit of skin that sort of hangs over the beak, so it's not immediately obvious that that's what it is. The picture was taken as part of a photo competition by a young girl, and it was her pet turkey, but it just looked for all the world to me like some sort of demon, and I thought, well, that's a really cool basis for a sculpture, right? So I wanted to try and do that. Now, obviously, I have a bit of a challenge here. How do I create all these sort of intricate folds of skin and all this sort of texture that's going on here? So this is really a bit of an experiment, I suppose, to see if I can create that type of texture. So in the video we're going to be going through various methods I've used to actually melt the monster clay to create these types of texture that you see on the sculpture. So let's get started. So this one started off the same as any sculpture, so I've got a little armature here and a base, and I'm just putting some soft monster clay to build up the basic form. Now this is monster clay that I've microwaved for a few minutes, so it's nice and soft, and that makes it easy to work with, and I can just build up the basic shape of the sculpture. For this one, I found myself getting a little bit too caught up in my projects, I think, recently. In that I sort of have an idea and then my imagination runs riot and I start imagining, well, you know, this could go here and I could cast this up in like resin and that could be clear and this could have LEDs in it and so on and so forth. And before I realise it, I've imagined 6 months of intensive work for myself. So what I'm trying to do this year is to come up with maybe slightly smaller scale projects or maybe slightly more conservative ideas which aren't going to take months and months to realise. That way you can sort of get that hit of realising an idea that you've got bouncing about in your head, but you don't have to wait 6 months to actually get to that point. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to do a sort of a short sculpture. I'm not going to worry about moulding it. I'm not going to worry about casting or painting or anything like that. Obviously the idea does present itself, but what I'm going to do is sit with the sculpture for a few weeks, and if it's still staring at me in say a month going, please mould me, then I guess I will. But for the time being, I'm not worrying about any of that. I'm just concentrating on the sculpture and thinking about all the textures and shapes that I'm going to put into it. And one of the first things I did was start experimenting as to how I could get some interesting textures. And I've been looking on Amazon trying to find some interesting sculpting tools that I can potentially use on projects. So I bought these, so they were very cheap. You got like 5 for like a tenner, I think. And they're just some basic rakes. So what I'm doing here is just scratching some detail into the monster clay. And what I want to do is actually melt this with a blowtorch to see if the melted monster clay will yield any sort of interesting textures. So I've got all these bits of monster clay that are sort of bubbled up on the surface, and as you can see, when you pass the blowtorch over them, they sort of bead up and turn into little blobs. So what I'm trying to do is actually use those to create some texture that sticks out of the shape that I'm making. Often when you're cutting texture into a sculpture, you're subtracting material away from it. You know, you're cutting channels and putting holes in it. But I was thinking, well, if I can get all this stuff bobbled up on the surface, that will allow me to have some additive detail basically. Now, after a bit of experimentation, I came up with this, which I quite like the look of actually. It's got the look of some sort of mottled skin, I suppose, some sort of wrinkly skin. So I quite like the look of that, so I'm going to sort of keep that one in my back pocket, probably for the back of the sculpture. But I think it's going to be a nice way of adding some texture to these larger surfaces, which at the minute are quite smooth. So the turkey's got this sort of mottled skin on the front of its head, which almost looks to me a little bit like a brain. It's got that sort of channeled kind of look that a brain has. So I'm just putting some basic shapes in place here, trying to build up that sort of basic shape. And what I'm doing here is just coming in again with the blowtorch and melting these together to see if I can get them to blend. Now obviously if you go too long with the blowtorch, these things will just melt into a big puddle, so you have to be a little bit careful to not just blast it too much. But some sort of shallow light passes over it with a bit of heat, does help soften up some shapes and sort of give them a bit more of a natural organic look. So I don't mind the way that's looking, so I'm just continuing to add some additional shapes on top here. I've also taken to using these silicone shape tools as well. They're really good because they just create a very light impression in the clay, so if you want to cut some quite subtle organic looking details into these shapes, I found that the silicone tools are really good for that because they just give you quite a gentle effect, which you don't get with steel tip tools. So I'm also building out the front of the face as well. I'm just adding in some additional shapes here to sort of break up that piece and give it a bit of visual detail. Now obviously the turkey in the reference image has got all this really wrinkly skin sort of down on its chest and around its neck, and I need to think of a way of creating those folds. Now I could try and sculpt them of course, but I don't think I'd get that sort of natural organic look that they have. So one technique that I've used before, and this was when I was trying to do some pewter casting I think, was to pour some molten monster clay into water. The idea being that the water would cause the monster clay to set quite quickly, and that might trap some organic shapes in the clay as it flows into the cold water. So that's what I'm trying to do here, and I'm just having a bit of an experiment as to how to do this. So what I've got here is some molten monster clay that I've heated up in the microwave for a few minutes, and that's really runny. What I eventually found was that pouring the monster clay into the water quite slowly was the best way of doing this. I let it cool down just a little bit, so it was a little bit more viscous than when it was completely runny. But as you can see, it's starting to yield some quite interesting shapes. Right, so here's some examples of some of the shapes I've got, and as you can see there's some really interesting shapes here, and some of them really do look quite organic, so I think they're going to be quite useful. And as you can see, some of these really look like internal organs. I particularly like the really thin strands that are coming off here. They look a little bit like intestines or something. So yeah, really interesting set of shapes to use. Some of these are a little bit too spindly perhaps to actually fully incorporate in, but I think this is really interesting technique, and I can definitely see this being useful for sculptures in the future. So what I'm trying to do here is melt the monster clay on the sculpture with the blowtorch, and then push the shapes that I've made with the water into the clay to join them all together. So this is really just a question of sort of piecing these things together and trying to make it look like they're one sort of cohesive piece. So about halfway through I started thinking that I would actually like this to be a little bit taller, so what I'm doing here is just cutting the sculpture in half basically, and moving it slightly further down the armature so that I can increase the height of the neck. And I'm just using some more molten monster clay to build that back up again. So I'm now just creating some more wrinkled skin texture on the side of the sculpture here. So something else I wanted to try is to actually melt the monster clay with a heated tool. So what I've got is this, which is a pyrography pen, and that's what you would use to burn designs into wood. Now, I've had this for ages and never really found a use for it, but I thought it might be quite good here to actually use on the monster clay. And as you can see, I've got a bunch of different heads for this, so I'm going to have a bit of an experiment and see which of these might be best for doing this. I've tried doing this before by heating a steel tool with a blowtorch, but obviously the heat doesn't stay for any length of time, so I think this is going to be really useful because it's electronic and it'll stay heated. So as you can see, the pen's quite happily melting the monster clay, and that's given me some quite interesting organic detail. So after a bit of experimentation, I'm really liking this actually. It's a really nice way of creating some soft, organic looking detail, and it actually looks quite natural in places, which is really, really cool. So I was able to blend the sculpted detail that I did with the pyrography pen quite easily with the molten monster clay pieces that I'd created by pouring it into the water. So I'm just putting an eye in here as well, and it being sort of a Lovecraftian horror, it's going to have several eyes. So I got to this stage and I started thinking, I'm not too happy with the sort of beak section, as it were. It looks a little bit too much like a bird for my liking. So what I decided to do was to start splitting these out into tentacles instead. There we go, looking a little bit more like a true Lovecraft creature, I think. So I'm just adding some additional shapes here to blend the tentacles into the sort of brain section just above. And once again, the pyrography pen's proving really useful to blend all of these shapes together. I decided to use it to actually texture all of the tentacles, and that was actually a really easy way of getting some nice detail onto those. So after a while I actually decided I didn't like this larger eye, so I'm just pulling that out and getting rid of that. So for the back I used a mixture of the pyrography pen and the scratching technique that I talked about earlier, and I'm just sort of created some sort of random textures on the back of that. And to be honest, I could probably spend a little bit more time refining these, but I think it's good enough just for the back. And for this sort of brain section, it was a little bit too smooth for my liking, so I'm just scratching some detail into this with the rake, and I'm then going to come in with the blowtorch and soften all that up. Right, so there we go. So this is quite a fun project to do actually, and I really enjoyed experimenting with different techniques to create these textures in the monster clay. What I will say is the pyrography pen worked really, really well. I think it might have been a little bit too hot, in that if you had monster clay on it for too long it would start to burn. And I have noticed on Amazon you can get pyrography pens which come with a power supply where you can actually change the temperature of the pen. So I think if I was going to use this routinely, which I may well do, I might well pick one of these up just so I can have a bit more control over what the pen is doing. But as a sort of an experiment, I'm quite happy with that. I like the organic look of it. So that's quite nice. So yeah, I think that's it for this one. Like I say, I may well mould this in the future, I may well not. I'm actually thinking maybe I might make a smaller version of this, perhaps, if it were something that I wanted to sell ultimately. But for the time being, it's just going to remain as a sculpture. So if you've made it this far through, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.